You are in medieval Europe, in the year 1487, living as a villager in a small community where suspicion hangs in the air like morning mist, and where a single accusation can transform your neighbor into your executioner. The scent of burning wood mingles with something far more sinister in the air. You can hear the church bells tolling in the distance. But today they do not call for prayer. They call for judgment. Your bare feet press against the cold stone floor of your modest home as you peer through the wooden shutters. Outside, a crowd has gathered in the village square, their faces twisted with fear and righteous anger. Someone has been accused, again, but this time you notice something that makes your blood run cold. They are looking at your house. Welcome to the most terrifying period in European history, where being different meant death, where healing the sick could brand you as evil, and where the very qualities that made you human could send you straight to the flames. The healer's burden, Margaret Thornfield, pressed her weathered hands against the rough wooden table, her 48 years evident in every line etched around her grey eyes. The morning light filtered through the single window of her cottage, casting long shadows across the dried herbs hanging from the ceiling beams. Chamomile, lavender, willow bark, each one a potential salvation or damnation, depending on who was asking. "Please," whispered the young woman, standing at her door, clutching a bundle wrapped in coarse cloth. "My baby, she has the fever. The physician in town says there is nothing to be done, but I heard, ... double quotes." She trailed off, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Margaret had heard those words countless times in the 3 years since her husband Thomas had died of the plague. "I heard you can help. I heard you have remedies. I heard you can work miracles." What they really meant was, "I heard you might be a witch, but I am desperate enough not to care." The irony was not lost on her. The same hands that had pulled Judge Aldrich's daughter back from death's door to winters ago, saving little Catherine from the same fever that now threatened this child, were the hands the village whispered about in hushed tones. They feared her because she succeeded where others failed. They needed her because she succeeded where others failed. "Bring the child inside," Margaret said softly, stepping aside. The young mother's relief was palpable as she hurried into the cottage. But Margaret noticed how she avoided touching her, how she kept her eyes downcast. As Margaret examined the infant, her practiced fingers checking for signs of the sweating sickness that had claimed so many that summer, she could not shake the feeling that eyes were watching her cottage. Through the window, she glimpsed a figure in dark robes, speaking earnestly with several villagers. Father Benedict. Her heart sank. The baby was burning with fever, but Margaret had seen worse. A tincture of willow bark, careful monitoring through the night, and prayers to whatever God might be listening, Christian or otherwise. She had learned long ago that survival often required appealing to forces both sacred and ancient. "Your daughter will live," she told the mother, mixing the remedy with steady hands, despite the fear growing in her chest. "But you must give her this every 4 hours, and you must not speak of coming here. Do you understand?" The woman nodded eagerly, pressing a small pouch of coins into Margaret's palm. "Bless you," she whispered, then paused. They say you consort with dark forces, but I think perhaps you consort with angels. If only it were that simple," Margaret thought as she watched the woman disappear into the forest path. In this world, the line between angel and demon was drawn not by divine judgment, but by the trembling hands of frightened men who confused knowledge with evil and independence with blasphemy. As the sun climbed higher, Margaret began preparing for what she feared was inevitable. She had felt the shift in the villagers' mood, seen the way conversations stopped when she passed, noticed how even her few remaining friends had grown distant. The Malleus Maleficarum, that cursed book that had arrived with the new inquisitor, had poisoned minds against women like her, women who lived alone, women who knew too much, women who refused to be invisible. She carefully hid her most valuable herbs and closed the shutters tight. Outside, she could hear voices growing louder, more confident. They were coming for someone today. In her heart, she knew it would be her. But Margaret Thornfield had not survived plague, poverty, and widowhood by surrendering easily. If they wanted to call her a witch, perhaps it was time to show them what a woman with nothing left to lose could accomplish. The afternoon shadows were growing long when the knock came. Not the desperate tapping of someone seeking help, but the heavy, authoritative pounding of those who came to take rather than receive. Margaret Thornfield called a voice she recognized as Father Benedict's. By order of the Church, and in the name of our Lord, you are summoned to answer charges of witchcraft and consort with the devil. Margaret smoothed her rough woolen dress and touched the small cross at her throat, a gift from Thomas on their wedding day. She had always found it curious that the same God who commanded them to heal the sick would condemn those who actually did so. She opened the door to find not just Father Benedict, but 6 men from the village, including Judge Aldrich himself, the same man whose daughter she had saved. His eyes would not meet hers. "Father Benedict," she said calmly, though her heart raced like a trapped bird, "what brings you to my humble home?" "You know why we are here, woman. The infant you treated this morning, young Mary's child, she has taken a turn for the worse. The mother confessed to seeking your remedies." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "The child was improving when they left. What has happened? She burns with fever still, and now she speaks in tongues, words no Christian child should know. What devil's poison did you give her?" No, Margaret thought desperately. The tincture was perfect, the dosage correct, unless, her mind raced, had the mother given too much, too little? Or was this simply the fever running its natural course, now twisted into evidence of her supposed evil? "I gave her medicine, nothing more. Willow bark tea, as any healer would prescribe." Judge Aldrich stepped forward, his face a mask of rigid duty. "Margaret Thornfield, you stand accused of practicing witchcraft, of making a pact with Satan, and of causing harm through supernatural means. You will come with us now to await trial." As rough hands seized her arms, Margaret caught sight of a figure watching from the edge of the forest. A woman with dark hair and knowing eyes, someone she had never seen before, yet who looked strangely familiar. The woman raised her hand in what might have been greeting or warning, then melted back into the trees like morning mist. The last thing Margaret saw as they dragged her toward the village was smoke rising from her cottage roof. They were burning her herbs, her books, her life's work. Everything that had made her valuable was being reduced to ash, leaving only the crime of having been valuable in the first place. But as they bound her hands and led her toward whatever fate awaited, Margaret Thornfield made a silent vow. She would not go to her death quietly, and she would not go alone. If this village wanted to believe in witches, perhaps it was time they learned what real power looked like. The sun was setting behind the church spire when they locked her in the cellar beneath the courthouse. But Margaret was not thinking about the darkness ahead. She was thinking about the woman in the forest, and wondering if salvation sometimes came wearing the very face they taught you to fear. The priest's dilemma. Father Benedict Winford knelt before the altar in the pre-dawn darkness, his 55-year-old knees protesting against the cold stone floor. The candles flickered in the drafty chapel, casting dancing shadows across the carved crucifixion scene above him. He had been praying for 3 hours, yet peace remained as elusive as morning mist. "Forgive me, Lord, for I know not what I do." The Latin words of his prayer felt hollow in his mouth. How could he ask for forgiveness when he was not even certain what sin he was committing? Was it a sin to doubt the accusations against Margaret Thornfield? Or was the sin in having brought those accusations in the first place? His hands trembled as he touched the leather-bound copy of the Malleus Maleficarum that lay beside him on the altar, the book that had arrived 3 months ago with instructions from the church hierarchy, along with whispers that Bishop Cromwell was sending inquisitors to root out the growing problem of witchcraft in their region. Benedict had read every page, trying to reconcile its teachings with everything he had learned in his years of theological study at Oxford. The book proclaimed that women were naturally inclined toward evil, that their supposed weakness made them easy prey for Satan's influence. Yet Benedict had spent decades ministering to the women of this village, and he had seen more strength, compassion, and faith in them than in many of his male colleagues. Margaret Thornfield, in particular, had always struck him as one of the most genuinely Christian souls he had ever encountered. So why, he asked himself for the 100th time, did I let them arrest her? The answer came to him in Judge Aldrich's voice from the previous evening. Father, surely you understand that we cannot appear weak in the face of evil. Bishop Cromwell expects results, and the people expect protection. Would you have us ignore clear signs of witchcraft? Clear signs? Benedict almost laughed at the bitter irony. A child with fever who spoke in delirium. What child with severe illness did not babble strange words? A woman who knew how to prepare healing remedies, knowledge that had been passed down through generations of village women, long before any of them had heard of the Malleus Maleficarum. But there was another reason for his torment, one he dared not admit even in prayer. He was in love with her, not in the carnal way that would damn his soul outright, but in the deep, abiding way that recognized a kindred spirit. Margaret Thornfield was the only person in this village who could discuss theology with him as an equal, who had read enough to understand the complexities of faith, who questioned not out of blasphemy but out of a genuine desire to understand God's will. Their conversations over the years had been the bright spots in his otherwise lonely existence. When she had asked him once why a loving God would allow children to die of plague, he had not dismissed her as a doubting woman. Instead, they had spent hours discussing the problem of evil, the nature of divine justice, and the possibility that human understanding was simply too limited to comprehend God's plan. Perhaps, she had said during one of their talks, we are meant to be his hands in healing the sick, rather than simply accepting suffering as his will. It was a perspective that had influenced his own ministry, leading him to encourage the villagers' healers rather than condemn them, until now. The chapel door creaked open behind him, and Benedict quickly rose from his knees. He turned to see a figure silhouetted against the grey dawn light, a woman in a dark travelling cloak, her face hidden by shadows. Father Benedict. Her voice was cultured, with an accent he could not place. I apologize for disturbing your prayers, but I have travelled far to speak with you. The chapel is not yet open for morning services, he said carefully. Something about this woman set his nerves on edge, though he could not say why. Perhaps you could return later, or speak with me in the rectory. She stepped forward into the candlelight, and Benedict felt his breath catch. She was perhaps 28 years old, with striking dark hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to see straight through him. Beautiful, yes, but it was not her beauty that unsettled him. It was the way she moved, with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed, and the way her gaze seemed to weigh and measure everything it touched. My name is Isabella Ravenscroft, she said, pushing back her hood. I have come from London on a matter of some urgency. I understand you have recently arrested a woman named Margaret Thornfield on charges of witchcraft. Benedict's wariness deepened. What business is that of yours, Miss Lady Ravenscroft? She corrected smoothly. And it is my business because I have been tasked by certain parties in London to investigate reports of witch hysteria in this region. There are concerns that innocent people are being condemned based on superstition rather than evidence. The Church does not act on superstition, Benedict said stiffly, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if they were true. Isabella smiled, and the expression was both beautiful and terrible, does it not? Tell me, Father, do you truly believe that Margaret Thornfield consorts with the devil? You, who have known her for years, who have seen her tend the sick and comfort the dying, do you honestly believe she has sold her soul for the power to harm children? The question hit him like a physical blow, not because it was unexpected, but because it voiced the doubt that had been eating at him since the moment he had agreed to the arrest. He began, then faltered. The evidence suggests, the evidence, Isabella interrupted, suggests that a child became sicker despite treatment, and that frightened people needed someone to blame. How many healers have you known whose patients all recovered? How many physicians can claim never to have lost a soul to illness? Benedict sank onto the front pew, suddenly feeling every one of his 55 years. What would you have me do? Defy the church? Ignore the wishes of the civil authorities? I am one man, bound by vows of obedience. Isabella moved closer, and he caught a whiff of some exotic perfume, roses and something darker, more complex. You were also bound by vows to serve truth and justice, are you not? To protect the innocent. You speak as if you know the church's teachings well, he observed, studying her face in the candlelight. Are you a woman of faith, Lady Ravenscroft? Something flickered in her green eyes. Pain, perhaps, or old anger. I was raised in the church, Father. I know its teachings intimately. I also know how those teachings can be twisted to serve the ambitions of cruel men. There was a story there, Benedict realized, some personal tragedy that had brought this mysterious woman to his chapel in the hour before dawn. But before he could probe further, she continued, Margaret Thornfield's trial is set for tomorrow, is it not? Judge Aldrich will hear the evidence and render his verdict. Yes, Benedict confirmed reluctantly, though I suspect the outcome is already decided. The people are frightened, and Judge Aldrich is under pressure from the bishop to show results. Then we have little time, Isabella said, rising from her seat with fluid grace. I propose a bargain, Father Benedict. Help me save Margaret Thornfield, and I will help you save your own soul. What do you mean? I mean that if you allow an innocent woman to burn for the crime of being inconveniently knowledgeable, you will carry that sin for the rest of your life. But if you stand up for truth, even when it is difficult, even when it costs you, then perhaps you will finally understand what it truly means to serve God. Benedict stared at her, this strange woman who had appeared like an answer to his prayers, or perhaps like a temptation sent to test his faith. What do you propose? Isabella's smile returned, and this time it held genuine warmth. Meet me tonight, after Vespers, at Margaret's cottage. There are things you need to see, truths you need to understand, before you decide whether to speak in her defense or remain silent while she burns. And if what I find confirms her guilt, then I will stand beside you at her execution, Isabella said simply. But Father Benedict, what if what you find proves her innocence beyond all doubt? What if you discover that the real evil in this village comes not from a lonely widow who heals the sick, but from those who would destroy her for doing so? She moved toward the door, then paused and looked back at him. One more thing, Father. When you see Margaret today, ask her about the night Judge Aldrich's daughter nearly died. Ask her exactly what she did to save the child's life. I think you will find her answer illuminating. And then she was gone, leaving only the scent of roses and the echo of words that would haunt Benedict for the rest of the day. As he knelt again before the altar, Benedict found that his prayers had changed. No longer did he ask for guidance in following orders. Instead, he prayed for the courage to follow his conscience wherever it might lead, even if it led him straight into the arms of a woman whose very presence made him question everything he thought he knew about good and evil, faith and doubt, salvation and damnation. The sun was fully risen now, painting the chapel windows in brilliant gold and crimson. In a few hours, he would visit Margaret in her cell, and he would ask her the question Isabella had posed. But deep in his heart, he already knew what her answer would be, and he feared what he would have to do with that knowledge. The widow's defiance, Lady Cassandra Whitmore, stood at the mullioned window of her manor house, watching the smoke rise from the direction of the village. Even from this distance, she could smell the acrid scent of burning herbs on the morning breeze. They had torched the healer's cottage. Then, as was customary when arresting a suspected witch, another woman's life reduced to ash and suspicion. At 36, Cassandra had learned to recognize the signs of a witch hunt brewing. The nervous glances from servants, the whispered conversations that stopped when she entered a room, the way even her own steward now spoke to her with barely concealed unease. Being a wealthy widow who dared to manage her own affairs was dangerous enough in any time. In these days of hysteria over witchcraft, it was practically a death sentence. "My lady," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see Thomas, her elderly butler, standing in the doorway with obvious reluctance. "Judge Aldrich requests an audience with you. He waits in the main hall." Cassandra felt her stomach tighten, but her expression remained serene. "Of course. Please inform His Honor that I will join him presently." She took a moment to compose herself, smoothing the rich burgundy silk of her gown and checking that her jewelry was properly arranged. Appearance mattered in these encounters. Too plain, and they would see weakness to exploit. Too fine, and they would whisper of unnatural wealth gained through dark bargains. She had learned to walk the narrow line between the two. Judge Aldrich rose as she entered the hall, offering a perfunctory bow that barely concealed his impatience. He was a stern man in his 50s, with graying hair and cold blue eyes that had condemned dozens to death over his career. Behind him stood two younger men she recognized as his clerk and one of the village constables. "Lady Whitmore," he said without preamble, "I trust you have heard about the arrest of the witch Margaret Thornfield." "I heard that a healer was arrested on suspicion of witchcraft," Cassandra replied carefully, "though I confess I find it difficult to believe that poor Margaret poses a threat to anyone." The judge's eyes narrowed. "You know the woman well, then. It was a trap, and they both knew it. Admit to knowing Margaret, and she would be guilt by association. Deny the acquaintance, and she would appear dishonest. Margaret had been seen visiting the manor several times over the years. I know her as the village knows her," Cassandra said, "a widow who tends the sick and asks for little in return. Hardly the stuff of dark legends, I would think. Yet you employed her services yourself, did you not? Several times, according to my records." Cassandra kept her voice level, though her pulse quickened. "When my late husband was ill, yes, I sought remedies wherever they might be found, as would any devoted wife." "And what manner of remedies did she provide?" "Herbs for his pain, tinctures to help him sleep. Nothing that could not be found in any good Christian household." The lies came easily. Margaret had indeed provided conventional remedies for Richard's final illness, but she had also performed other services, rituals that eased his passing in ways the church would never understand or forgive. Judge Aldrich stepped closer, and Cassandra caught a whiff of wine on his breath, despite the early hour. "Lady Whitmore, I will speak plainly. There are those in the village who whisper that your own ... independence is not entirely natural. A woman who manages vast estates without male guidance, who makes business decisions that consistently prove profitable, who seems to know things before they happen." "Ah," Cassandra thought, "so we come to it at last. Are you suggesting, Your Honor, that successful management of my late husband's affairs is evidence of witchcraft? If so, I fear you will need to arrest half the widows in England." "I am suggesting," the judge said coldly, "that your association with a known witch, combined with your own ... unusual capabilities, warrants investigation." Cassandra felt the familiar surge of rage that had gotten her into trouble so many times before. These small, petty men who could not imagine a woman succeeding through intelligence and determination, who needed to attribute female competence to supernatural forces because the alternative threatened their very understanding of the world. "Tell me, Judge Aldrich," she said, allowing a hint of steel to enter her voice, "when your own daughter was dying of fever to winters past, and no physician could save her, who did you send for in desperation? Was it not the same Margaret Thornfield you now condemn as a witch?" The judge's face flushed red. "How dare you? And when she pulled little Catherine back from death's door, did you condemn her then? Or did you offer your gratitude and a purse of gold for her services? That has nothing to do with ... It has everything to do with this." Cassandra snapped, her careful composure finally cracking. "You would condemn the woman who saved your child's life because it serves your political ambitions, because Bishop Cromwell demands results, and a frightened village needs someone to blame for their troubles." The silence that followed was deafening. The clerk had gone pale, and even the constable looked uncomfortable. Judge Aldrich's hand moved instinctively to the sword at his side. "Careful, Lady Whitmore," he said in a voice like winter wind. "Your words border on sedition. The church and its representatives are not to be questioned by whom?" Cassandra interrupted. "By women, by those who dare to think for themselves. Tell me, Your Honor, what exactly makes a woman a witch in your learned opinion?" She began to pace the room, her silk skirts rustling with each step. "Is it knowledge of herbs and healing? Then you must arrest every woman who tends a garden. Is it the ability to read and write? Then I fear most of the nobility are suspect. Is it success in business? Then perhaps we should examine your own affairs, since I hear your investments have been remarkably profitable of late." Judge Aldrich's face had gone from red to white. "You go too far, woman, do I? Or do I simply refuse to bow and scrape while you destroy innocent lives to advance your career?" Cassandra stopped directly in front of him, close enough to see the fear flickering behind his anger. "You want to know what makes a woman dangerous to men like you, Judge Aldrich? It is not commerce with devils or knowledge of dark arts. It is the simple refusal to pretend we are less than we are." For a moment, she thought he might strike her. His hand twitched toward his sword, and she saw the calculation in his eyes. Could he arrest her here and now? Would her wealth and noble connections protect her, or would they simply make her a more valuable target? Then the moment passed, and he stepped back with visible effort. "I came here as a courtesy, Lady Whitmore, to give you the opportunity to distance yourself from the accused, which I see that courtesy was wasted." "Indeed it was," Cassandra agreed. "I will not abandon Margaret Thornfield to satisfy your ambitions or ease the fears of superstitious fools." "Then you share her fate," he said simply. "The trial begins tomorrow. I suggest you spend this evening in prayer, asking forgiveness for your sins. You may find you have more to confess than you realize." After they left, Cassandra remained standing in the center of her hall, trembling with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She had crossed a line today, one that could not be uncrossed, by openly defying Judge Aldrich, by refusing to sacrifice Margaret for her own safety. She had essentially signed her own death warrant, but perhaps that had always been inevitable. From the moment she had refused to remarry after Richard's death, from the first time she had walked into a business meeting and demanded to be taken seriously, from every decision to live as if her gender did not automatically make her inferior, she had been walking toward this confrontation. The sound of hoofbeats on the drive interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she saw a lone rider approaching at great speed. A woman, she realized with surprise, riding astride like a man and wearing traveling clothes that spoke of both wealth and practicality. The rider dismounted with fluid grace and strode toward the manor's entrance. Cassandra hurried to the front door, curiosity overriding caution. Lady Whitmore. The woman was perhaps 28, with striking dark hair and intelligent green eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. "My name is Isabella Raven. I have come from London regarding the witch trials in your village." London. Cassandra studied the newcomer with interest. There was something about this Isabella Ravencroft that set her apart, an aura of competence and barely contained power that Cassandra recognized in herself. "What brings London's attention to our small troubles?" Isabella's smile was sharp as a blade. "Let us say that certain parties have an interest in ensuring that justice is done, rather than merely the appearance of justice. I understand you are acquainted with the accused woman, Margaret Thornfield." "I am, and I suspect, given the timing of your arrival, that Judge Aldrich has already marked me as her accomplice. Indeed, which is why I am here." Isabella stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Lady Whitmore, I am going to speak plainly because we have little time. Margaret Thornfield is innocent of the charges against her, as I suspect you know, but she will burn tomorrow unless we act to prevent it. We, Cassandra, raised an eyebrow. What exactly are you proposing, Miss Ravencroft? Lady Ravencroft, Isabella corrected. And I am proposing that we save Margaret's life, expose the corruption behind these trials, and perhaps demonstrate to certain small-minded men that underestimating women can be a very dangerous mistake. There was something in the woman's tone that sent a shiver down Cassandra's spine, not of fear, but of recognition. Here was someone who, like herself, had learned that sometimes survival required embracing the very darkness they accused you of harboring. Tell me more, Cassandra said, stepping aside to allow Isabella entry. But first, answer me this. Are you here as an agent of the Crown, or do you have more personal reasons for wanting to see justice done? Isabella's green eyes glittered with something that might have been old pain or fresh determination. Let us say that I have my own reasons for ensuring that witch hunts do not go unopposed. Men like Judge Aldrich have taken too much from too many women. It is time they learned what it truly means to face their victim's wrath. As they walked together into the manor, Cassandra felt a thrill of anticipation she had not experienced since her husband's death. For too long, she had fought her battles alone, always on the defensive, always reacting to threats rather than creating them. But now, it seemed, she had found an ally. And if Isabella Ravencroft was half as dangerous as she appeared, then perhaps Margaret Thornfield would not be the only one walking away from tomorrow's trial alive. The game, as they said, was afoot, and Cassandra Whitmore had never been one to back down from a challenge. The midwife's ancient wisdom, Alara Blackthorne, had delivered over 300 babies in her 65 years, and she had learned to read the signs that preceded death as easily as those that heralded new life. This morning, as she sat in her small cottage grinding dried angelica root, she could smell death on the wind. Not the clean death of old age or honest disease, but the foul stench of fear-driven murder that men called justice. The knock on her door came precisely when she expected it would. 3 sharp raps, followed by the voice of authority demanding entry. She did not hurry to answer. At her age, with her reputation, there was little point in pretending surprise. Alara Blackthorne called Judge Aldrich through the heavy oak door. Open, in the name of the Church and the Crown. She set down her mortar and pestle with deliberate care, brushing the herb dust from her gnarled fingers. Her joints protested as she rose from her chair, but she had learned long ago not to show weakness to those who hunted it. The door opened to reveal not just the judge, but Father Benedict and 4 armed men. More than they had brought for Margaret, she noted. Perhaps they were finally beginning to understand what they were dealing with. "Good morning, Your Honor," she said, with a courtesy that bordered on mockery. "Have you come seeking my services? I am afraid I no longer attend births for those who would see me burn." Judge Aldrich's face darkened. "You will come with us to answer charges of witchcraft, devil worship, and the murder of innocents through sorcery." Alara almost smiled. "Murder of innocence. How many children have I delivered safely into this world, Your Honor? How many mothers have I saved from childbed fever? But I suppose saving lives counts for little when you need scapegoats for your failures. You stand accused of causing the deaths of 3 infants and 2 mothers in the past year through your unholy practices," the judge continued, clearly reciting from prepared notes. "Witnesses have sworn that you perform pagan rituals during births, that you call upon ancient gods, and that you possess knowledge no Christian woman should have." Now Alara did smile, and the expression was terrible to behold. "Ancient gods, you say? Tell me, Judge Aldrich, when your own wife lay dying in childbirth 15 years ago, what prayers did I whisper over her? Do you remember?" The judge went pale, but Father Benedict stepped forward. "Alara, please, do not make this harder than it must be. Come with us peacefully, and perhaps, ... Perhaps what, Father?" she interrupted. "Perhaps I will be granted the mercy of strangulation before they light the fire." How kind. She turned her attention back to Judge Aldrich, studying his face with the intensity she usually reserved for examining a breached birth. You were so grateful then, were you not? When I turned the babe and saved them both, you wept with relief and pressed gold into my hands, swearing eternal gratitude. What changed, I wonder? That has nothing to do with ... everything. Ilara's voice cracked like a whip. You owe me your son's life and his mother's. Yet here you stand, ready to condemn me for the same knowledge that preserved your family. Tell me, Your Honor, is this how you honor your debts? For a moment, something flickered in the judge's eyes, shame, perhaps, or the ghost of genuine gratitude. But it passed quickly, replaced by the cold certainty of a man who had convinced himself that necessity justified any betrayal. The woman you were then and the witch you have become are not the same, he said stiffly. Your practices have grown darker, more dangerous. The recent deaths prove it. Ilara threw back her head and laughed, a sound like winter wind through dead leaves. Darker, more dangerous. You fool, my practices have not changed in 40 years. What has changed is your need for someone to blame for the failures of your precious church-trained physicians. She moved to her shelf and began pulling down jars of herbs, handling each with reverent care. Shall I tell you about those deaths you lay at my feet? Young Sarah Miller, who bled to death because her husband insisted on calling the new physician instead of me. By the time they brought me in, she had been laboring for 2 days without proper care. But somehow, her death becomes my fault. Judge Aldrich shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. Or perhaps we should discuss little Anne Carpenter, born too early because her mother was beaten by her drunken husband. The babe lived 3 days, 3 days longer than any church-trained physician said was possible. But because I could not work miracles, I am blamed for her death. She turned to face them fully, her aged face fierce with righteous anger. You want to know what real witchcraft looks like, Your Honor? It is not the knowledge of herbs or the whispered prayers to goddesses older than your Christ. Real witchcraft is the magic that transforms living, breathing women into convenient scapegoats for the failures of incompetent men. Father Benedict stepped forward, his face pale but determined. Ilara, I have known you for 20 years. I have seen you save lives that others had given up for lost. But I have also heard you speak words that are not Christian, seen you perform rituals that ... that predate your religion by 1,000 years, she finished. Yes, Father, I remember the old ways. I remember when women were honored for bringing life into the world instead of feared for it. I remember when birth was sacred, not shameful. She moved to another shelf, this one filled with objects that made the men step back instinctively. Carved stones, bundles of feathers, small figures shaped from clay and wood. Do you know what these are, Father? They are the tools of my trade, passed down from my grandmother and her grandmother before her. Each one has helped save a life, eased suffering, brought joy where there was despair. They are pagan idols, Father Benedict said, but his voice lacked conviction. They are symbols of the divine feminine, the life-giving force that your church has spent centuries trying to suppress. You teach that women are weak, sinful, inferior. Yet when a woman is dying in childbirth, when a babe refuses to breathe, when death stalks the birthing chamber, then suddenly you remember that there are mysteries beyond your understanding, powers your theology cannot explain. Judge Aldrich had heard enough. Seize her, he ordered his men, and gather up those blasphemous objects as evidence. But as the soldiers moved forward, Ilara raised her hand, and something in her bearing made them pause. She seemed to grow taller, more imposing, despite her advanced years. The very air in the cottage seemed to thicken with expectation. You may arrest me, she said quietly, but you cannot arrest the knowledge I carry. You cannot burn away the wisdom of centuries, the skills passed from mother to daughter since time began. Other women will learn what I know. Other hands will guide new life into this world. She looked directly at Father Benedict, and her voice softened. Some of them are closer than you think, Father. Some of them may already be among you, learning to hide their gifts, to speak in whispers what was once proclaimed with pride. As they bound her hands and led her from the cottage, Elara caught sight of a familiar figure watching from the edge of the village square. Margaret Thornfield, under guard but somehow managing to communicate with her eyes. Behind Margaret stood a woman Elara did not recognize, dark-haired, expensively dressed, with the bearing of nobility. But there was something about her that seemed familiar, as if she carried the echo of someone Elara had known long ago. The woman raised her hand in a gesture that looked like a simple wave to the casual observer, but Elara recognized it as something else entirely, a sign she had not seen in decades, a symbol of the old sisterhood that had once connected all wise women across the land. As the guards pushed her roughly toward the jail, Elara felt a surge of hope she had not expected. Perhaps the old ways were not as dead as she had feared. Perhaps there were still those who remembered that before there were witch hunters, there were simply women who refused to let their knowledge die with them. The sun was high overhead when they locked her in the cell next to Margaret's. Through the barred window, she could see smoke still rising from her cottage. They were burning her life's work, destroying the accumulated wisdom of generations. But knowledge, true knowledge, could not be destroyed so easily. Elara. Margaret's voice came through the thin wall between their cells. Are you hurt? Nothing that matters, Elara replied. What of you, child? Are you holding up? I think help may be coming. There was a woman, someone I have never seen before. She seemed to know things, to understand. Elara smiled in the darkness of her cell. Yes, I saw her too. Perhaps the wheel is finally turning. Margaret, perhaps it is time for the hunters to become the hunted. Outside, the church bells began to toll, calling the faithful to evening prayers. But Elara was not thinking of the Christian God as she knelt on the cold stone floor. She was thinking of older powers, deeper mysteries, and the unbreakable bond that connected all women who had ever brought life into the world against impossible odds. Tomorrow they would face their accusers. Tomorrow they might burn. But tonight, in the gathering darkness, Elara Blackthorn whispered prayers to goddesses whose names had been forgotten by history, but whose power remained as real as breath, as vital as blood, as eternal as the cycle of birth and death and rebirth that no church could ever truly control. The scholar's dangerous questions. Edmund Ashworth pressed his 19-year-old face against the cold stone wall of his cell, straining to hear the voices of the guards outside. 3 days had passed since they had dragged him from the monastery library. 3 days since his entire world had collapsed into accusations of heresy and devil worship. His black cat, Aristotle, was nowhere to be seen, probably dead, killed as evidence of his supposed communion with dark forces. The irony was not lost on him that he had been named after a saint, raised by Benedictine monks, and devoted his life to understanding God's creation through the study of natural philosophy. Yet here he was, condemned as a servant of Satan because he had dared to suggest that the movements of celestial bodies followed natural laws rather than divine whim. The boy is dangerous. He had heard Judge Aldrich tell Father Benedict the night before. His questions undermine the very foundations of faith. If we allow such blasphemy to spread, Edmund had wanted to laugh at the absurdity of it all. Dangerous him, a young man whose greatest weapons were books and astronomical instruments, whose only crime was an insatiable curiosity about the world around him. But then he remembered the fear in Brother Marcus's eyes when the accusations had first been made, the way the other monks had stepped away from him as if he carried plague, the whispered conversations that stopped when he entered a room. Perhaps he was more dangerous than he had realized, not because he consorted with devils, but because his questions threatened the comfortable certainties upon which their world was built. The heavy door of his cell creaked open, and Edmund turned to see Father Benedict entering with a tray of bread and water. The priest looked haggard, as if he had not slept in days. "Father," Edmund said, rising to his feet, I had hoped you might come. Benedict set down the tray with hands that trembled slightly. Edmund, I need you to tell me the truth. Have you been practicing forbidden arts? Calling upon demons? Making pacts with the devil? Father, you know me better than that. You taught me Latin yourself, guided my studies in theology and natural philosophy. Have I ever shown any interest in dark magic or devil worship? No, Benedict admitted. But then, your interest in astronomical calculations, your questions about the movements of planets. Some say these are forms of divination, attempts to predict the future through unholy means. Edmund felt a familiar surge of frustration. Father, understanding the natural world is not the same as practicing magic. When I calculate the position of Mars or predict an eclipse, I am not communing with demons. I am observing the orderly patterns that God Himself built into His creation. But why must you ask such questions? Why cannot you simply accept that God moves the heavens as He wills, without seeking to understand His methods? Edmund stared at the older man, seeing not just confusion but genuine pain. Father Benedict was struggling with the same doubts that plagued many educated men of their time, the tension between faith and reason, between accepting received wisdom and pursuing new knowledge. Because, Father, I believe that God gave us minds capable of understanding His creation precisely so that we might marvel at its complexity and beauty. When I chart the course of a comet or explain why the moon changes shape, I am not diminishing God's glory. I am revealing the elegance of His design. Benedict sat heavily on the small stool beside Edmund's bed. The accusers say that your cat would sit on your books while you studied, that you spoke to it as if it understood your words. They claim this proves it was your familiar, a demon sent to guide your studies in forbidden directions. Despite everything, Edmund almost smiled. Aristotle was a cat, Father. Cats sit on whatever their owners are paying attention to. It is their nature. As for speaking to him, do you not sometimes speak aloud when you are working through a difficult problem? It helps clarify one's thoughts. His name was Aristotle, Benedict said quietly, the pagan philosopher whose works the Church has struggled to reconcile with Christian teaching. A philosopher whose logic and methods have enhanced our understanding of God's creation, Edmund countered. Thomas Aquinas himself drew heavily upon Aristotelian principles in his theological works. Yes, but Aristotle also wrote about astronomy, about the eternal nature of the universe, about ideas that some consider incompatible with Christian doctrine. Edmund saw the trap that was closing around him. Every aspect of his education, every tool he had used to understand the world, was being twisted into evidence of heresy. His love of learning had become proof of his corruption. Father, may I ask you something? When you look at the night sky, what do you see? Benedict frowned at the unexpected question. I see the glory of God's creation, the beauty of the heavens that declare His majesty. And when I look at the same sky, I see the same glory, but I also see patterns, mathematical relationships, evidence of the incredible intelligence that designed it all. Does this make me less faithful, or more so? Before Benedict could answer, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed in the corridor. The priest rose quickly, his face troubled. Edmund, the trial begins tomorrow. Judge Aldrich has already made his decision. The evidence against you is too strong, the fear in the community too great. Unless you confess your sins and renounce your studies, unless you publicly admit to practicing witchcraft, I cannot confess to crimes I have not committed, Father. I cannot renounce the pursuit of knowledge that has brought me closer to understanding God's creation. Benedict's shoulders sagged in defeat. Then God help you, my son, because I fear no earthly power can save you now. As the priest left, Edmund sank onto his narrow bed and stared up at the small window high in his cell wall. Through it, he could see a patch of sky, a few stars beginning to appear in the gathering dusk. Mars was visible tonight, the red wanderer that had fascinated him since childhood. In a few hours, Jupiter would rise, followed by the constellation of Orion with its distinctive belt of 3 bright stars. How many others had looked up at those same stars over the centuries? How many had wondered about their nature, their movements, their meaning? And how many had been silenced by those who feared questions more than ignorance? A sound from the corridor made him turn. Someone was approaching multiple someones by the sound of their footsteps. Had they come for him already? Was the trial to begin tonight? But the footsteps stopped at one of the other cells, and he heard the low murmur of voices. Then came a sound that chilled his blood, the distinctive creak of a cell door opening, followed by a woman's cry of pain. "Margaret," called another female voice from further down the corridor. "What are they doing to you?" "Just ... Questioning, came the strained reply. "Nothing I cannot endure." Edmund pressed his face to the small window in his cell door, trying to see what was happening. In the flickering torchlight, he glimpsed figures in dark robes surrounding a woman he recognized as Margaret Thornfield, the village healer. She was bound to a chair, and one of the men held what appeared to be a hot iron. "Tell us about your pact with the devil." Judge Aldrich's voice carried clearly in the stone corridor. "Confess your crimes, and the pain will stop." "I have no pact," Margaret replied through gritted teeth. "I am a healer, not a witch." The smell of burning flesh reached Edmund's nostrils, and he turned away from the window, sickened. This was what awaited him tomorrow. Torture designed not to elicit truth, but to extract whatever confession his accusers desired. As the interrogation continued, Edmund found himself thinking about the nature of truth itself. In his studies, truth was something that could be tested, verified, demonstrated through observation and logic. But in the world of the witch hunters, truth was whatever those in power decided it should be. Evidence was manufactured, confessions were forced, and reality itself became subordinate to fear and prejudice. The irony was bitter. He had devoted his life to seeking truth through reason and observation, only to find himself condemned by men who had no interest in truth at all. They feared his questions, not because they led to dangerous answers, but because they exposed the fragility of certainty itself. Hours passed before the corridor fell silent again. Edmund had tried to block out the sounds of Margaret's suffering, but each cry had cut through him like a blade. When dawn finally came, he was exhausted but sleepless, dreading what the day would bring. The trial would be a mockery, he knew. The verdict was already decided, the evidence already fabricated. But perhaps, if he was given the chance to speak, he could plant seeds of doubt in some minds. Perhaps someone would remember his words and wonder if the pursuit of knowledge was truly as dangerous as the fear of it. As the sun climbed higher, Edmund Ashworth knelt on the cold stone floor of his cell and prayed, not for salvation, for he expected none, but for the courage to face his accusers with dignity. If he was to be condemned for seeking truth, then at least let him die as he had lived, with his mind open to the wonders of creation and his spirit unbroken by those who would chain it. Outside his window, the morning star shone bright against the pale sky. Venus, the Romans had called it, though he knew it was not a star at all, but another world, perhaps not so different from their own. The thought comforted him somehow, that beyond the narrow confines of this village, beyond the reach of witch hunters and inquisitors, the universe continued its ancient dance, indifferent to human folly and immune to the fears of small-minded men. If he was to burn for loving that dance, for trying to understand its steps, then perhaps burning was not the worst fate after all. The child who sees Lydia Fletcher crouched in the shadows of the old oak tree behind the church, her 11-year-old heart pounding so hard she was sure everyone in the village could hear it. The visions had come again last night, clearer and more terrible than ever before. She had seen the flames, smelled the smoke, heard the screams, but this time she had also seen something else, a way to stop it all. The problem was that saving the condemned witches would require her to reveal the very gift that had branded her as one of them. 3 days ago, she had been just another village child, albeit one who sometimes knew things she should not know. when old Farmer Garrett's cow had gone missing. She had pointed to the exact spot where they would find it trapped in a ravine. When the miller's baby had fallen ill, she had told them it would recover on the third day, and it had. Small things, easily dismissed as coincidence or lucky guessing. But then she had made the mistake of warning Emma Cartwright about the fire. "Do not light your kitchen hearth tomorrow morning," she had told her friend's older sister. "Wait until afternoon, when the wind shifts." Emma had laughed and tousled Lydia's hair. "What makes you say such a thing, little one?" "I saw it," Lydia had replied without thinking. "The flames climbing the wall, the thatch catching fire, your baby brother crying in the smoke." Emma's laughter had died abruptly. The next morning, she had delayed lighting her fire, telling herself it was foolish to heed a child's fancy. But as noon approached and the wind began to pick up, she found herself remembering Lydia's words. When she finally lit the hearth in the afternoon, a log rolled out onto the stone floor, exactly where it would have ignited the wooden wall if the fire had been lit earlier. When the wind was blowing toward the house instead of away from it. By evening, the entire village knew that Lydia Fletcher could see the future. By the next morning, they were calling her a witch. Now she huddled in her hiding place, watching through a gap in the oak's massive trunk as the final preparations were made for the trial. A platform had been erected in the village square, with stocks for the accused and a chair for Judge Aldrich. Bundles of wood were being stacked nearby, not for warmth, but for burning. The visions had shown her exactly how it would unfold. Margaret Thornfield would be brought out first, followed by older Lara and the young scholar Edmund. One by one, they would be given the chance to confess their sins and beg for mercy. One by one, they would refuse, and one by one, they would be condemned to burn. But the visions had also shown her something else, a moment when everything could change. When a single word spoken at the right time could save them all. The problem was that speaking that word would cost Lydia her own life. "There you are," came a soft voice behind her. Lydia spun around to find a woman she had never seen before, tall, elegant, with dark hair and knowing green eyes. The woman smiled and settled herself on the ground beside the tree, apparently unconcerned about her fine dress touching the dirt. "You are Lydia Fletcher," the woman said. It was not a question. "Who are you?" Lydia whispered, glancing nervously toward the village square. "My name is Isabella Ravencroft. I have come to help." "Help who?" "The innocent, if I can. The condemned, if I must. And you, most particularly." Lydia studied the stranger's face, searching for signs of deception or threat. Instead, she found something that made her breath catch, a sadness so deep and old that it seemed to have roots stretching back through centuries. "You are like me," Lydia said suddenly. "You see things too." Isabella's smile was bitter. "I see many things, child, but the gift of sight often comes with the curse of knowing truths we cannot change." "I can change this," Lydia said fiercely. "I know how to save them. I have seen it. Have you? Or have you seen what you wish to see?" The question struck Lydia like a physical blow. She had been so certain of her visions, so confident in her ability to interpret them. But now, looking into Isabella's ancient eyes, she began to doubt. "Tell me what you have seen," Isabella said gently. Lydia took a shuddering breath. The trial, the accusations, Margaret and the others refusing to confess, Judge Aldrich condemning them to burn. But then I step forward and tell everyone about my visions. I tell them that I have seen the truth, that the accused are innocent. And what happens when you do? Judge Aldrich demands proof of my gift. I tell him about the merchant's wagon that will arrive this afternoon, carrying news of the king's victory in battle. I describe the exact words of the messenger, the color of his horse, the gift he brings for the judge. When it all comes to pass exactly as I predicted, the people will believe me. They will have to. Isabella nodded slowly. Yes, I can see how that might work. But tell me, child, what happens to you in this vision? Lydia's throat tightened. I save them. That is all that matters. That is not what I asked. For a long moment, Lydia could not speak. When she finally found her voice, it was barely a whisper. They burn me instead. Isabella's expression softened with something that might have been maternal tenderness. You are very brave, Lydia Fletcher, braver than most adults I have known. But you are also very young, and there are things about this world that you do not yet understand. I understand enough, Lydia said defiantly. I understand that innocent people are going to die unless someone stops it. And you believe that someone must be you. Who else you? You are a stranger here. They will not listen to you. Father Benedict, he is too frightened to speak the truth. Judge Aldrich himself, he cares more about his reputation than justice. Isabella was quiet for a moment, watching the activity in the square. You know, when I was about your age, I had a vision too. I saw my sister being dragged away by men who called her a witch. I saw the flames, smelled the smoke, heard her screams, and I thought, as you do now, that I could save her if I was brave enough to try. What happened? I ran to the village square, just as you planned to do. I shouted that they were making a mistake, that my sister was innocent. I offered to prove it by demonstrating my own gift of sight. Lydia felt her heart sinking. And they burned you both. No, Isabella said quietly. They burned her while I watched, helpless and chained. Then they kept me alive, using my gift to hunt down others like us. You see, child, they did not want to eliminate seers entirely. They wanted to control us, to turn our abilities to their own purposes. The revelation hit Lydia like a physical blow. In all her visions of heroic sacrifice, she had never considered the possibility that her gift might be perverted, used as a weapon against other innocent people. But, Isabella continued, that was 15 years ago. I have learned much since then about the nature of power, about the difference between noble sacrifice and effective action. What do you mean? Isabella smiled, and this time the expression held genuine warmth. I mean that there are ways to save the innocent without condemning yourself to the same fate. Ways to use your gift that do not require you to reveal it publicly. She leaned closer, lowering her voice. Tell me, Lydia, have you seen what happens if the trial is delayed? If, perhaps, Judge Aldrich receives urgent news that requires his immediate attention elsewhere. Lydia frowned, trying to peer into the future along this new path. The visions came slowly at first, then with increasing clarity. I see ... a messenger arriving just as the trial begins. He brings word of a rebellion in the Northern Territories. Judge Aldrich is ordered to leave immediately with his men to help suppress it, and the prisoners, they remain in custody, but the trial is postponed indefinitely. Without the judge's authority, the village lacks the power to execute them. Eventually, Lydia's eyes widened. Eventually, they are released for lack of evidence. Very good. Now, do you see yourself in this vision? Lydia shook her head, confused. No, I am not involved at all. But how could such a messenger arrive? There is no rebellion in the north. Isabella's smile was mysterious. Is there not? How can you be certain? After all, news travels slowly in these times. Perhaps there are events unfolding that have not yet reached this quiet village. Understanding dawned on Lydia's face. You are going to create the rebellion. I am going to ensure that Judge Aldrich receives the news he needs to hear, at precisely the moment he needs to hear it. And you, my dear child, are going to help me by making sure we have all the details exactly right. For the first time in days, Lydia felt hope stirring in her chest. This was better than her original plan. It saved the innocent without requiring anyone to die, and it left her free to continue using her gift to help others. What do you need me to do? Isabella reached into her traveling bag and withdrew a small leather pouch. I need you to look into the future and tell me exactly what Judge Aldrich will be wearing today, what he will have for breakfast, what words he will speak when the trial begins. Every detail must be perfect for this to work. Lydia closed her eyes and let her consciousness drift forward. seeking the threads of possibility that would become reality. The visions came easily now, clear and detailed. She described everything she saw. Judge Aldrich's blue doublet with silver buttons, his breakfast of bread and ale, his opening words about the holy duty of purging evil from their midst. As she spoke, Isabella took notes in a small book, her quill scratching quickly across the parchment. When Lydia finished, the woman nodded with satisfaction. Perfect. Now, one more thing. I need you to look carefully at the exact moment when the trial is supposed to begin. What do you see? Lydia focused on that crucial moment, the point where all possibilities converged into a single thread of fate. I see Judge Aldrich taking his seat on the platform. Father Benedict is standing beside him, looking pale and frightened. The first prisoner, Margaret, is being brought forward, and then, ... Yes, a rider appears at the edge of the square. He is covered in dust from hard travel, and his horse is lathered with sweat. He carries a message bearing the royal seal. Judge Aldrich reads it, and his face goes white. He stands and announces that urgent business requires his immediate departure. The trial is postponed until his return. Isabella closed her book with a snap. Excellent. Then we have our plan. As they prepared to leave their hiding spot, Lydia caught Isabella's arm. Lady Ravenscroft, may I ask you something? Of course. In your visions of the future, the far future, years from now, do you see this ending? The witch hunts, the burnings, the fear. Isabella was quiet for a long moment. I see many possible futures, child. In some, the darkness deepens and spreads. In others, light begins to dawn. The future is not fixed. It is shaped by the choices we make, the courage we show, the love we refuse to surrender even in the face of hatred. Which future do you think is most likely? Isabella smiled and touched Lydia's cheek gently. The one we create together, my dear. The one we create together. As they walked back toward the village, Lydia felt something she had not experienced in weeks. The sense that she was not alone, that her gift was not a curse, but a tool that could be used to protect the innocent and expose the truth. Whatever happened in the trial today, whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them with allies who understood both her power and her burden. The sun was climbing toward noon, and the village square was filling with spectators eager to witness justice being done. But if Isabella Ravenscroft's plan worked, they would witness something very different, the beginning of the end, for those who would murder the innocent in the name of righteousness. Lydia Fletcher, the 11-year-old seer who had once thought she must die to save others, walked toward her destiny with her head held high and hope burning bright in her young heart. Epilogue: The wheel turns. 10 years later, Margaret Thornfield stood in the garden behind her new cottage, her hands deep in the rich earth as she tended the herb beds that had become her life's work once again. At 58, her hair was completely grey now, but her eyes still held the keen intelligence that had once been labelled as evidence of witchcraft. The scars on her wrists from the ropes that had bound her had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look for them. The cottage was larger than her old one, built with money provided by grateful patients, and, she suspected, by the mysterious Lady Ravenscroft, who had appeared so providentially during those dark days 10 years ago. It sat on a hill overlooking the village that had once condemned her, close enough to serve those who needed healing, far enough away to live in peace. The village itself had changed dramatically since Judge Aldrich's sudden departure and the collapse of the witch trials. The man had never returned from his urgent mission to suppress the Northern Rebellion, a rebellion that, as it turned out, had been greatly exaggerated in the reports that reached him. By the time he discovered the truth, his reputation had been so damaged by his abandonment of his post that he had quietly retired to a monastery, seeking redemption for sins that weighed heavily on his conscience. Father Benedict had assumed leadership of the community in the judge's absence, and under his gentle guidance, the hysteria had gradually subsided. The imprisoned witches had been quietly released, their charges dismissed for lack of evidence. The village had slowly learned to see its healers and wise women not as threats to be eliminated, but as valuable members of the community to be treasured. Not all of them had survived the transition. Old Alara Blackthorn had died peacefully in her sleep to winters after her release, her body finally giving out after decades of service to others. But she had lived long enough to pass her knowledge on to younger women, ensuring that the ancient wisdom would not die with her. Edmund Ashworth had flourished in the changed atmosphere. Now 29, he had become the village's unofficial scholar, teaching reading and mathematics to children whose parents had once feared education as a path to damnation. His astronomical observations had proven valuable to farmers and sailors alike, and his predictions of eclipses and planetary movements had earned him a reputation for natural philosophy rather than dark magic. Aristotle II, a sleek black cat who had appeared at Edmund's door shortly after his release, had become as much a fixture of his lessons as his books and instruments. Young Lydia Fletcher, now 21, had grown into a remarkable woman whose gift of sight had proven invaluable to the community. She served as an unofficial advisor to merchants and farmers, helping them make decisions based on her visions of weather patterns and market conditions. More importantly, she had become a healer in her own right, working alongside Margaret to treat both physical ailments and the emotional wounds left by the dark years of the witch hunts. Lady Cassandra Whitmore had used her wealth and influence to establish a network of safe houses throughout the region, places where women with unusual gifts could find refuge and training. Her manor had become an unofficial academy where knowledge once deemed dangerous was preserved and passed on to new generations. She had never married again, finding her independence far more valuable than any security a husband might provide. And Isabella Ravencroft, she had vanished as mysteriously as she had appeared, leaving behind only a letter thanking them for their courage and promising that their story would not be forgotten. Some claimed to have seen her in other villages where witch hunts were brewing, always arriving just in time to prevent tragedy. Others whispered that she had founded a secret society dedicated to protecting those with unusual gifts. Margaret suspected the truth was probably both simpler and more complex than the rumors suggested. As Margaret worked in her garden on this peaceful afternoon, she reflected on the lessons learned during those terrible days. The real evil had not been in the knowledge of herbs or the ability to see the future. It had been in the fear that transformed neighbors into enemies, the ambition that used others' suffering for personal gain, and the cowardice that allowed good people to remain silent while innocents were condemned. But there had been goodness too. Father Benedict's eventual courage in standing up for truth, Lady Cassandra's refusal to abandon those in need, young Lydia's willingness to sacrifice herself for others, Edmund's determination to seek knowledge despite the cost, even old Ilara's fierce protection of ancient wisdom in the face of modern fear. The wheel of history had turned, as wheels do. The witch hunts that had swept across Europe were finally beginning to wane, replaced by new ideas about reason, evidence, and human dignity. It would be centuries before the fear of powerful women disappeared entirely, but seeds of change had been planted. Margaret smiled as she watched Lydia approach through the garden gate, carrying her medicine bag and wearing the confident expression of someone who knew her worth and refused to hide it. Behind her came Edmund, his arms full of books and scrolls, eager to share some new discovery. In the distance, Margaret could see the spire of the church where Father Benedict still preached, now emphasizing love and understanding rather than fear and judgment. "Margaret," Lydia called out, "Mrs. Carpenter's youngest has that fever again. Can you spare some willow bark tea?" "Of course," Margaret replied, wiping the soil from her hands. "And Edmund, what brings you here today?" The young scholar grinned. "I have calculated the exact date of the next solar eclipse, and I wanted to share the news. In 3 months' time, we will witness one of nature's most magnificent displays, and no one will need to fear it as an omen of doom." As they walked together toward the cottage, Margaret felt a deep sense of contentment. The dark years had tested them all, but they had emerged stronger, wiser, and more united. They had learned that true power came not from inspiring fear, but from healing, teaching, protecting, and serving. The sun was setting behind the hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere in that vast world beyond their peaceful village, other battles were being fought, other innocents were standing trial, other heroes were finding the courage to speak truth in the face of lies. But here, in this place they had helped to heal, the wheel had turned toward light. And that, Margaret thought as she prepared remedies for those who needed them, was more than enough for one lifetime. Father Benedict appeared at the garden gate, his face bearing the peaceful expression of a man who had found his true calling. Margaret, Lydia, Edmund, he greeted them warmly. "I have news from the capital. The last law permitting witch trials has been repealed. The age of burning innocent women for the crime of being wise is officially over." The friends looked at each other with quiet satisfaction. They had lived through history's turning point, had helped push the wheel toward justice and reason. The fear that had once ruled their lives was finally being replaced by understanding. "And what of our friend Isabella?" Margaret asked. "Have you heard any word of her whereabouts?" Father Benedict smiled mysteriously. "Curious you should ask. I received a letter yesterday from a colleague in France. It seems a mysterious lady has appeared there, just as witch hunters were preparing to arrest a group of midwives. The trials were mysteriously cancelled when the local judge received urgent orders to report to Paris immediately. She continues her work," Lydia said with admiration. "Wherever innocents are threatened, wherever fear tries to triumph over love, as do we all," Edmund added, "each in our own way, with our own gifts." Margaret nodded, looking around at the faces of those who had become more than friends. They had become family, bound together by shared trials and the knowledge that they had helped change the world for the better. The age of witch hunts was ending, not with grand proclamations or royal decrees, but with the quiet courage of individuals who refused to let fear triumph over love, ignorance over wisdom, or hatred over hope. They had learned what so many throughout history had discovered, that the real magic was not in supernatural powers or devil's bargains, but in the simple human capacity to choose compassion over cruelty, truth over convenience, and love over fear. In her garden, surrounded by healing herbs and dear friends, Margaret Thornfield smiled and returned to her work. There was always more healing to be done, more knowledge to be shared, more light to kindle in the darkness. And she had learned that this, too, was a kind of magic, the most powerful kind of all. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the four friends stood together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts, but united in their shared understanding. They had witnessed the worst of human nature, but they had also discovered the best. They had seen how quickly fear could transform good people into monsters, but they had also learned how courage, compassion, and truth could transform the world. The wheel would continue to turn, as it always had and always would. There would be new challenges, new fears to overcome, new innocence to protect, but they had proven that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than knowledge, courage, and love, could stand against the darkness and emerge victorious. The witch hunts were over in their corner of the world, but more importantly, the spirit that had allowed those hunts to flourish, the willingness to destroy what we do not understand, to fear what threatens our certainties, to sacrifice others for our own security, that spirit had been dealt a mortal blow. In its place had grown something stronger, the understanding that difference was not danger, that knowledge was not evil, that power shared was power multiplied. They had learned to see the divine not in the suppression of human gifts, but in their celebration and nurturing. Margaret picked up her basket of herbs and headed toward the cottage, where tomorrow she would begin preparing remedies for those who needed them. Lydia gathered her notes on weather patterns and market predictions. Edmund carefully rolled up his star charts and astronomical calculations. Father Benedict prepared to return to his church, where he would write a sermon about the triumph of love over fear. Each of them carried forward the lessons of those dark days, determined to ensure that future generations would never again confuse fear with righteousness, or mistake the persecution of the innocent for the service of God. The last light faded from the western sky, and the first stars appeared overhead. Venus shone bright and clear, the same planet that had comforted Edmund during his imprisonment, now a symbol of hope and continuity. The universe continued its ancient dance, indifferent to human folly but somehow blessing human courage. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to heal and teach and protect. But tonight, in this moment of peace and fellowship, they were content to know that they had played their part in turning the wheel of history toward justice. The age of witch hunts was ending. The age of understanding had begun.